Hi, hey guys, how's it going? It's Ryan Delgado, and welcome. And today I wanted to just kind of start a little bit of a series here on drawing. This was kind of requested that I talk a little bit about how to improve in your drawing skills. I don't know exactly what this person meant by, how to improve, but I figured probably the best way to go about this was to just kind of go over the fundamentals here right off the start, and excuse me, to kind of talk about the basic principles that that go into how we understand realism, how we understand representational art. And really the basic fundamental exercise is the value sphere, and I'm sure many of you have done this before and have seen this lesson before. If you're anything like me, if you're an art student or you've been an art student before, you've done this exercise before. But I don't know about you guys, but for me, the takeaway, I remember doing this when I was in college. It was my very first exercise, my very first assignment in my freshman year drawing class, and the takeaway was never really taken away. So I was a little, I was confused about why we were doing this. Why our instructor just handed us a sphere, very similar to this one, and said, "Here, draw this ball." I did it. I didn't do it very well. The actual lesson of this was never really, at least to my recollection, it was never really hammered down. So it wasn't until much later that I realized what the actual lesson here was and why it's so important. This is I would say, the fundamental, the most basic model of how to understand form, of how to understand the idea of translating three-dimensional form, a three-dimensional object, onto a two-dimensional surface. So the way that we do this is by breaking it down, by looking at our object, in this case a sphere, and breaking it down into very simple concepts, very simple principles. And I've got those written down right here so that you can see them clearly. Number one, there's line. That's probably the most foundational, other than a single point. But we have line, and this kind of takes me back to geometry, actually. But we have line, and we can also think of this in terms of edges. A lot of us, a lot of artists will talk about it in terms of edges. And edges are really just what create this second one, which is shape. And in this case, it's a circle. When you apply value to shape, and value is basically just your light and shadow, your two families of light and shadow. And when you apply value to shape, that's when you have form. That's when you create the illusion of form on a two-dimensional surface. And so they work together to create the illusion of three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface. So I'm going to kind of just talk a little bit and show you a little bit about how we do that, how we break this down. I've just got a circle drawn here, and this little arrow that I have here is an indication of the light source and the direction that the light is coming in. And so if I were to just sort of draw two, or just kind of rough in two guidelines here of where this light is coming from, of where it's hitting the object. This will give me an indication of where our cast shadow is, and our cast shadow is basically the shadow that that the object creates on the surface that it's resting on. That's our cast shadow. So we actually have two different types of shadows that we're working with. We have cast shadow and we have form shadow. And this is cast shadow. This is the shadow that the object creates. And form shadow is it's basically how the light interacts with the object. And that's how we get form shadow. And form shadow is indicated with a what's called a core shadow. And the core shadow is the darkest part of the form itself, of the sphere. So this is really, it's an indication of three dimension. It's a reference point for understanding the three-dimensionality of the sphere. In other words, this core shadow, this little line of the core shadow, is going to be the darkest part of the sphere. It's going to be the darkest part of this form shadow. And the form shadow is basically all of this. It's the part of the sphere that is in shadow. That is your form shadow. So if I go ahead and fill this in, I'll go ahead and fill in the shape of the cast shadow as well, and just roughly, we'll get to it in a minute. But this crescent shape right here is our form shadow. And this line here is called the core shadow, or otherwise known as the terminator. And the terminator is really just a line of shadow. It's this line of dark shadow on the sphere that that again gives us an indication of the form, of the rounded form. This, because it's the darkest part, it's the furthest away. If you were to imagine, it is the furthest away from the light. It's the plane, basically, that is closest to you, the viewer. If I, again, take this this sphere right here, and I point out the core shadow on this, it's going to be basically right around here. Well, this is pretty much perpendicular to our eyesight, our eye level. And so it's kind of the plane on the form that is closest to us. And so in that sense, it's going to be the darkest part of the form shadow. And so I want to be sure to indicate that, to make sure that I establish that. And the second thing to understand here about light and shadow is that light is light and shadow is shadow. They are two distinct families. And so within our lights, we have kind of a subfamily of halftones. And the halftones, they're still in the light, but they are sort of the darker part of the light. They are where the light is transitioning into shadow. From the highlight and outward from the highlight, it is going to get gradually darker and darker and darker until our halftones, until our light meets our shadow. Meets our core shadow. The core shadow is really just sort of that marker of the transition from light into shadow. Now, the thing to remember when you're doing this, and by the way, like I said, this is just the fundamental, the foundational model for this. You're gonna encounter all of these principles in whatever it is you're drawing. It's just, this is the simplest model to really see these things, to really see how they work. And in every case, the thing you're going to discover, again, light is light, shadow is shadow, which means you have to be careful, you have to be aware and acknowledge these values, and acknowledge the fact that that your shadow is always going to be darker than your light. Even though you have two kind of similar values here, you have your dark halftones that are transitioning into this core shadow, but then as you move downward on this form shadow, as you move downward on the sphere, as it approaches this the surface that it's resting on, you're going to have reflected light. You're going to have light bouncing from the surface back onto the sphere. And so you're going to have a lighter value down here as you move closer. And again, this terminator shadow, this core shadow, is going to be the darkest part of the form shadow. But and that's why it kind of appears as a line of shadow, because as you move downward, you're going to have the reflected light. But the reflected light is not going to be the same value necessarily as even your darkest halftone right here. Again, shadow is shadow, light is light. And so one of the main lessons here is that never should your lightest dark be as light as your darkest light. And I'm going to say that again because it kind of gets confusing when you hear it at first, but if I can point it out, then hopefully it'll be a little clearer. But never should your lightest dark be as light as your darkest light. Remember, these halftones are part of the light family. So so even your reflected light, even your lightest dark, your lightest shadow should be darker than your darkest light, your halftones, your dark halftones. That's an important thing to remember, because you want to keep these families separate. You want to keep them. You want to keep a clear distinction between the two. So again, if I say that my core shadow, my terminator, is the darkest part of the form shadow, that's it's one of the references that I look at every time that I'm drawing. And I realize, this is just a sphere, and so we're not all going to be drawing spheres all the time, and so but these principles are you're going to encounter these things no matter what it is you're drawing. No matter what it is you're drawing, you're going to encounter these things. You're going to encounter core shadows, form shadows, cast shadows, reflected lights, halftones, highlights. All of these things are things that you're going to encounter. You're just going to encounter them in different forms, in different formats, different contexts. And so, but like I said, the sphere is the most basic model that we have to help us to understand these principles. So as we move towards light, it gets lighter and lighter, lighter and lighter, and again I am following angles here, following the planes of the form as I move towards the highlight, which again is probably going to be right around there. But this also means that, and it's not something we're necessarily going to see very clearly, at least with our naked eye, but it is technically, theoretically still there, and that is a small indication of halftone along this top edge. This top edge is not going to be as bright as our highlight. Again, we're wanting to depict the three-dimensionality of this, and so it's going to be so minuscule, so almost unnoticeable, but it is part of this if we're thinking about this in terms of 3 dimensions. That we're going to have a little bit of of that halftone coming along this top edge. And so if we can, let me go ahead and do a little bit more on the cast shadow, because the cast shadow has another part, another sort of part of this anatomy of the sphere, and that's what's called the dark accent. And the dark accent is the darkest shadow on your drawing. It's going to be the darkest part of the drawing. It's right where the sphere is resting on the surface. This is basically where no light is getting. But as we move outward, this cast shadow is going to get gradually lighter and lighter once again, because the light is doing so many crazy things. It's bouncing everywhere, and so it's going to be it's going to be getting into this cast shadow as it moves outward. And again, this is where we get another lesson in edges, because the edges of this cast shadow are going to gradually, as it gets lighter, it's going to get softer as well. And it's just kind of going to fizzle out as it reaches the very edge of it, the very end here. It's going to get a lot softer. Whereas the closer this cast shadow is to the object itself, the harder this edge is going to be of the cast shadow. So there's just a little basic understanding of the value sphere, and again, the idea here is hopefully to understand just the anatomy of this drawing, of this exercise. So we have our core shadow, again, which is the darkest part of the form shadow. And the form shadow is basically this crescent shape of shadow right here on the object. And then we have our reflected light. And the reflected light, of course, is where light again is bouncing back onto the surface of the sphere and creating this this glow that exists within the shadow, but it's still part of the shadow. It's a lighter part of the shadow due to that reflected light. And then we have our halftones, and halftones are basically where the light is transitioning into the shadow. It's gradually getting darker and darker as we move towards the terminator, the core shadow. And then of course we have our highlight, which is again right around here. So as I said, this is something that we're going to encounter in a lot of the things that we draw. And it's just going to take on a different form. One of the main places that you can see a lot of these principles, a lot of these things, are in figure drawings, and particularly the figure drawings of an artist called Pierre Prudhomme. He was a French artist, 19th century, and if you look at his drawings, you can see where he almost sort of exaggerates a lot of these things. He exaggerates the reflected lights and the core shadows in his drawings, in his figure drawings. And so by studying his drawings and by studying his figure drawings, you can really see how these things exist in any number of things that we'll encounter in our drawings, whether it's figures, portraits, or still lives, or anything else. These are really the the fundamental principles that we will encounter. So I hope this was helpful. I hope I was able to articulate some of the important things about the value sphere. Stay tuned for the next video. I'm going to be doing a little bit on portrait drawing and kind of taking you back to my early years as a teenager, and one of the things I discovered about drawing portraits that I think is pretty interesting. So stay tuned for that, and until we meet again, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. So God bless you all.